5-year-old Sean P. Diddy Combs has been behind bars for more than 2 months now, but here we are. The disgraced music icon has been held at the infamous Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn since September 16th, much to his counsel's dismay. You may recall Diddy's team has tried relentlessly to get him either transferred from MDC or released on bond, but to no avail. The defense has suggested a $50,000 bond, round-the-clock security, a GPS monitor, and even limited contact with women. Even still, he's consistently been denied release, so at least for now, MDC is his home. By now you know that Diddy's been indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and transportation to engage in prostitution. Prosecutors allege he's the kingpin in a decades-old sex trafficking scheme in which he drugged victims, sexually assaulted them, and recorded it all. That's where we get this notorious phrase, freak-offs, which prosecutors described as elaborate and produced sex performances that Combs arranged, directed, masturbated during, and often electronically recorded. Diddy originally used these recordings as blackmail to keep survivors quiet, but now they're being used against him as evidence that he's committed these federal offenses. After his arrest in New York, Diddy was booked at MDC. Back then, we took a deep dive into MDC's conditions, but they're really worth revisiting. Following Diddy's arrest, his attorney Mark Agnifilo immediately sounded the alarm on MDC, arguing there are some major issues with the jail, citing violence, poor conditions, overcrowding, and even staffing issues. He also cited some startling statistics. 2 inmates have been killed at MDC since June, and at least 4 inmates have died by suicide over the past 3 years. On top of that, 6 staff members have been charged with crimes over the past 5 years. Even with all these questionable stats, it's still common for defendants to be housed at MDC after their arrest, as they're awaiting trial in either Manhattan or Brooklyn. And the jail is no stranger to high-profile inmates either. MDC famously housed R. Kelly, Ghislaine Maxwell, and Sam Bankman-Fried, who's actually there right now. We've mentioned Sam Bankman-Fried to you in the past. He's the fraudster convicted of money laundering following the collapse of his cryptocurrency exchange, FTX. Sam Bankman-Fried became relevant to Law and Crime's audience when Diddy was arrested because both men were housed in the same part of MDC, a specific unit for inmates that required special protection. That's people like Diddy or Sam Bankman-Fried who are high-profile inmates, or even for other inmates who need protection during ongoing investigations. For some time, that's where Diddy was, the SHU, or the secure housing unit. But in recent days, he's been moved to general population, and that's where these new reports come from. Diddy has allegedly befriended some of his fellow inmates, who have apparently started helping him out with tasks like making his bed or cleaning his cell. Prosecutors allege Diddy is also using the phone accounts belonging to some of these other inmates. They say Diddy knows his phone line is being monitored, so by using the other phone lines, he hopes to keep his conversations private. According to court docs, Diddy is partaking in unauthorized 3-way calls as a way to send hundreds of texts, and some of these messages are apparently going to people on Diddy's no-contact list. The feds say Diddy has used the accounts of at least 8 other inmates, but they say he's doing more than that. They allege Diddy is also trying to corruptly influence witness testimony and taint the jury pool from behind bars. Prosecutors wrote, quote, "While attempting to invade law enforcement monitoring, the defendant has, among other things, orchestrated social media campaigns that are, in his own words, aimed at tainting the jury pool, made efforts to publicly leak materials he views as helpful to the case, and contacted witnesses through third parties." All right, I know you're multitasking when you're watching our videos, and if you are out and about running errands, listen up. You have to download this app, Upside. It's free and gets you cash back on daily essentials. I now use Upside every time I pump gas because it's so easy and it's free. Here's what you do. Download the Upside app and claim an offer for whatever you're buying. Pay as usual and then follow the steps on the app to get paid. To find out how much you could earn, click the link in the description to download Upside or scan the QR code on your screen and use our promo code LCNews to get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. Okay, so let's talk Diddy and the latest allegations. With me is former Metropolitan Detention Center warden Dr. D. Wayne Hendricks. Thank you for coming on again with us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so talking about Diddy, last time I talked to you, he was in a different part of MDC, a secure location for potentially high profile inmates. Now, could it be that P. Diddy is in Gen Pop or general population?
Yes, I'm assuming that after doing a threat assessment on him after being there for several weeks, was determined that he could be housed in a general population unit. And it's been my experience when I was there, several years ago. We have a east and a west building, and typically we had, since it's a detention center, you have all types of individuals there, high security, low security, minimum. And then you have folks like former law enforcement officers, and then folks that may have been compromised. And you also have sex offenders that are detainees. So what we would do, sometimes we would house some of our high profile individuals with former law enforcement who are facing charges for whatever criminal behavior that they were being alleged to have committed, as well as sex offenders, because typically when you put those two types of populations together, there's typically less jailhouse politics involved, and there's minimal risk to being harmed or dangered. So I'm assuming, from what I understand, he's in the West Building, which is it's an open bay unit. So they're not cells, they're like a dormitory style units, and they're open. And again, typically there's your low level offenders, typically possible sex offenders, alleged sex offenders, as well as former law enforcement who are facing charges. So I'm sure that's probably where he's being housed right now.
We're also getting some interesting reports since he's been moved to this area. One of the reports or tips we got is that other inmates are actually making Diddy's bed for him. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, that's not necessarily uncommon, especially for someone of his celebrity status, especially if he's being housed with individuals that aren't a threat to him, or he's not a threat to them. So I'm assuming they probably are maybe doing some favors for him, maybe even cooking food in the microwave. I mean, they don't have microwaves, probably whipping up some type of meals from the commissary dishes. Now, they are to have hot water at a certain temperature where they can cook certain processed foods that they buy in commissary, and they're also charged with having ice machines. So I wouldn't be surprised if they're probably not cooking for him, as well as doing other favors, maybe even washing his clothes. So that's not a surprise.
Why would some of these other inmates basically serve Diddy, cleaning up after him, making him this food, all of that? Do you think it's just because of his clout?
Well, I think maybe for some, some folks are just, you have a different makeup of individuals that are behind bars, and some of them may have idolized his music throughout the years, and some may think at some point maybe he'll do them a favor or solid, or make some contacts for them. At some point, during their stay at the detention center. So I'm not surprised by that, because I've also seen other high profile inmates, not necessarily someone as famous as Mr. Combs, but some people with what we call street credibility, whose name is pretty popular in the streets in different communities across the country. And folks would want to just be around that type of energy. So I'm not surprised by that at all.
It's not just making the bed and making him meals or snacks, though. Prosecutors actually say that P. Diddy has paid off some of these other inmates so that he can use their phone accounts. Because obviously, if he's using his own account, it could be monitored, it would be recorded likely. So if he's using other people's accounts, maybe the prosecutors wouldn't be able to hear what he was saying. What do you make of that? Do you think that's even possible?
Yes, and again, that's not an uncommon practice in jails and prisons across the country. Basically, it's a form of using the phones to make a three-way call. So, like in your words, so that these calls potentially might not be monitored, but all calls are recorded. However, the pack number is what we call it in the federal system. Each inmate is assigned to a pack number for their particular account, so that and it's voice recognition. So if someone goes to use their pack number, they would have to make the call because there is recognized. And then you would ask the individual, you use the phone to call someone on your phone, on your contact list. and then you would say, hey, can you make a three-way call to this particular number? And then when that individual comes on the phone, then Mr. Combs or another individual who's trying to make the three-way call would get on the line and then start having their conversation. But I just don't really understand why Mr. Combs is using this strategy, because these calls are going to be monitored. These calls are going to be looked at. So I really don't understand I understand why he's doing it, for whatever purpose he's trying to evade these calls to be recorded. But at the same time, he has to be self-aware enough to realize that the jail staff and as well as the prosecution team is going to want to know who's making calls and that kind of thing. And then I can also explain in terms of them being paid. We have this, and I'm not going to give the name of the software, but there's software that the agency utilizes to see what we call the degrees of separation. So you can see which person is sending different individuals in these lockups money, and you can see who's all contacted. So even if some of his associates or family is sending money to these individuals that are helping him use these phone calls, all the stuff is easily traced back. So obviously he's not understanding the rules and regulations and of the processes that the agency uses to monitor this type of behavior.
Yeah, you're right. I don't think he's flying under the radar if that's his goal, because obviously we're talking about it right now. And in addition to paying these people to use their phone calls, there's actually allegations that he's paid other people to post on Instagram in support of him. Obviously, this could be people outside in the other world. He suggested, you should post, whatever it may be. But what about on the inside? These people don't have access to Instagram, or do they?
No, and I think they had that jail sweep with different federal agencies that came to do to check for hard contraband, whether it's weapons, cell phones, or other contraband that the individuals in there shouldn't have. Now, does inmates do have cell phones sometimes? Yes, they do, and unfortunately, sometimes folks do have access, and then sometimes they have family on the outside post or friends or associates post on their behalf. So it's not uncommon. Unfortunately, I've seen even at jails and prisons I've operated, inmates were running YouTube channels during COVID-19 with cameras and different things of that nature. So they're very resourceful individuals. And, and unfortunately, sometimes those things does happen.
To your point, they are very resourceful. So we do know maybe they're not allowed to have these phones or access, but sometimes they do have them. I'm wondering if this then would amp up the amount of searches that the prison staff would make throughout. I mean, P. Diddy is a pretty big name. Obviously, we know that he's talking to the other inmates around him. Would then MDC staff be keeping an eye on his specific cell, maybe more than others?
No, I think each staff member that works each unit on a shift, there's 3 shifts in every day, and they're charged with doing cell searches, or in his case, area searches or bed searches, because he'd either be on the top or the bottom bunk, and his belongings would more than likely be under the bottom bunk along with his bunkmate. So obviously, there's going to be more eyes on his area. And again, there are a specific number of searches that they should be doing on a daily basis. And I'm sure his area is probably going to be more monitored. And more than likely, a lot of times what inmates would do, they would try to put some of their belongings or things that they don't want to be seen in another inmate's area, thinking that the staff wouldn't necessarily be looking at their area. So, but I would assume that they're probably shaking down that area quite often.
Now, we know that where he's at, obviously there's a lot of staff at MDC who are keeping eyes on Diddy and all the other inmates too, but he's the one we're talking about today. Tell me about this, because I'm not super familiar. Obviously, prosecutors are going to want to know if he's up to anything while he's behind bars. Would they then be in contact with any of the employees at MDC? Hey, we got a tip Diddy's doing this, or he might be doing that. What's that relationship like?
Well, I can tell you, while Miss Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell, was at MDC Brooklyn, she was housed in the special housing unit pretty much the entire time that she was there. And they would, the agency had different folks from different parts of the country come out and spend, a couple of weeks at a time to be in the area where she was being housed. And from what I understand, they were having meetings with the executive team on a daily basis, giving updates on with her or different things of that nature. So I would assume that the U.S. Marshals, along with the prosecution team from the Southern District of New York, is probably in frequent contact with the institution in regards to any information that they would need to know about as it relates to this particular case.
And one of the reasons we wanted to talk to you specifically is because of your past for several years working as deputy warden at MDC. So you're really familiar with the layout and the procedures, all of that. Are you still in contact with some people back there, hearing any information about what's going on since Diddy has been taken into jail?
Not necessarily anyone specific in the building, but just knowing how the agency operates, following the reports as you and your team does, and then understanding what, while I was still working in the agency, how they treated Miss Maxwell while she was in worked there in the facility, because I did have a couple of my staff travel out there, 2 to 3 times during the year in 2020 and 2021 and 2022. So yeah, I'm using my familiar surroundings and understanding how the agency operates to gather information and to be able to have these type of conversations, so the listening public will kind of have a clearer understanding of what may or may not be occurring in the facility.
We also know that P. Diddy's team has been adamant they want him released from jail. This hasn't happened as of yet, so he's still behind bars at MDC. If that continues and he's never allowed bail or bond, he's stuck there at MDC until he has his trial. What do you expect? Do you think he'll remain in this Gen Pop area, or he could go back to the more secure facility? What do you think that would look like?
Well, I can tell you the agency is really taking a look at the use of the special housing unit and not trying to confine individuals in what the public will call solitary confinement over extended periods of time unnecessarily, because they do have negative effect on individuals' mental and physical health long term. However, that is going to be determined by Mr. Combs. Like I would always tell new inmates when they would come into the facility, if you act like a human being, you will be treated as such. And if you disrupt the peace, we have process and procedures to get you back into compliance, and then we'll go back to what we call normal operations. So I think what we're seeing from him right now is probably going to have more ramifications later, especially if he is convicted of these charges, because, really as a pretrial detainee, if he is somehow found guilty, being able to mitigate any long sentences based on his behavior in the program and that's available there to him. And it will be in his best interest to start getting focused on programming, connecting with his family and those who really care about him at the end of the day, because these types of things, using inmates' PAC numbers and other things like that, making these type of violations, they're not going to bode well in the long run for him.
Well, Diddy's been at MDC for over 2 months at this point, and we're still learning new details about what's happening behind bars. Thank you, Dwayne, for coming on with us and giving us a look behind the curtain.
Thank you.
P. Diddy maintains his innocence. He's pleaded not guilty to sex crimes charges and is due back in court on Friday. Right now, his federal